Hey everybody, this is Tim Ash, and I want to first off thank all of you for the comments that have been flooding in today. When I did my kickoff speech this morning, I hope you got a sense of a little bit of the background. As I mentioned, I'm sometimes a bit of a private person, so I was glad to be able to share a little bit about myself with you. Also, really outline my vision for closing the gap between what I call the two Vermonts and explain more about what I mean by that. Really wanted to tell you who my campaign is really about, which is all the people throughout the state who I've come to know and be inspired by, who do so many different things to meet people's needs, to run successful businesses that take care of people and the planet. So it was really quite a treat to be able to really get things kicked off. And so with that, I have said that I'm going to do my Ask Me Anything here today. So it's a little bit of a break from my normal COVID-19 update, and want to start with some of the questions which have come in over the last couple days. We had solicited people who might have questions for me as I kicked off my campaign. Now, some of the questions are not exactly campaign related, although they do speak to the particular things that I'm going to bring hopefully to the table, because they reflect who I am, what my values are, what I've done. And so we'll kickstart it right off here. I had a question from Mike from St. Johnsbury. Mike says he's wondering when he's going to get his hazard pay grant. So let me briefly explain what he means. Back in the earliest days of the COVID-19 state of emergency, you'll recall that some people were called essential workers, and it was a term that had a definition. It was people who might be in grocery or certain retail that was necessary for people to meet their basic needs. People who work in cleaning, custodial, who were needed to take care of disinfecting different workspaces and things, whether it's a hospital or one of the manufacturing facilities that was still open. Lots of people engaging directly with the public. Along with some of my peers in the Senate, we felt very strongly that those individuals should receive some kind of hazard pay grant to recognize the risk that they took by showing up, that they were required to do, because they were required to show up at work, but also to make sure that people in those jobs weren't worse off financially as a result of actually going to work. As we know, if you were eligible for unemployment, maybe because your kid was out of school, so you could be home because you needed to watch your kid who would normally be at school, it could wind up being that you make less money being at work than if you were eligible to stay home. And so we wanted to create a grant program. The Senate did pass that by a vote of 28-0. So everyone from the most conservative to the most liberal members of the Senate voted for it. That bill is now over to the House. We're very hopeful that they will step it up and get that bill through so we can get it to the governor. We intend to use some of the federal funds in order to do that, which we think is really appropriate, because there's going to be funding to help small businesses get their feet back under them. There's going to be money to help healthcare facilities become revitalized. And we want to make sure that we don't forget all those people who showed up for work, who everyone was showering with thanks and praise at that point in time. We don't want to, look back a couple months from now and say, yeah, we gave them thanks, but very little else. So thanks, Mike, for that question, and hopefully we'll get that program underway so that you can get the recognition you deserve. Margaret from Addison says, in your speech you mentioned, this is a question that came in during the day. Margaret from Addison says, I noticed you said that you had passed legislation to keep kids safe from lead in schools. First I'm hearing about it. Well, like many things, I wish it wasn't the first that you were hearing about it, but that's the nature of the world we all live in, with so much information flowing. Early last year, working with a senator from Bennington, a senator from the Caledonia County, St. Johnsbury area, and some members of our education committee, we received a report from our Department of Health back when they weren't focused on pandemics. And what we learned was that in some tests that were done at a random selection of schools, the number of water sources, drinking water sources that had high levels of lead was really quite high. So we decided to require that every school test every source of drinking water, and also that every childcare facility, every water source would be tested for lead. We lowered the acceptable standard to be the lowest in the nation, and then we provided schools with the dollars they needed to remediate wherever necessary. It's usually almost a no-cost change. They'll just shut down a particular water faucet. You know, like you might have a bathroom at an elementary school with 8 different water fixtures. If 2 of them test positive, you just take those out of commission and leave the remaining 6. Each situation might have a different solution. The good news is, I believe every child care facility now in the state has been tested, or nearly everyone, and more than half of the schools have been tested. So I think when we look back on this one, it's actually going to be one of the most significant, comprehensive public health measures that we've taken. And frankly, my view is that it'll allow every parent, when they send their kid to school or a child care facility, to know that their kid's not getting poisoned when they drink water, which we hope they will do while they're there. Stephen and Brandon wrote, what are you going to do about energy storage? Well, energy storage is something that I'm familiar with because I think a lot about fighting climate change and renewable energy. I'm not sure that many people understand this new feature of the way we will do a better job fighting climate change. Basically, imagine a big box that stores lots of the power when it's being produced by wind or solar, and the box would store that power when the region doesn't need that electricity. And then when there is more demand for electricity, the box will start to release that power. So in places like the Northeast Kingdom, where there's wind that is generating, wind turbines that are generating power, and sometimes there's nowhere for the power to be sent, so they have to actually shut the turbines down. This would allow storage boxes to basically continue to receive the power that's generated so it can be sent back out after the fact. I think this is going to be a really transformative element to our state's meeting our state's climate change goals. We've started advancing the policies, and in the lieutenant governor's role, one of the things I'll be most excited about is to get outside the State House and work with many of the Vermont companies who are working precisely on advances in storage. So a lot of great promise there. James in Burlington wrote, what do you see as the role of the arts in Vermont? Well, it's a big question with a fairly simple answer from my point of view, but like a politician, every answer is simple, and then it, with more words becomes more complicated. I think the arts are central to what makes Vermont Vermont. Obviously, we have a very rich history of cultural creativity in almost every single medium. I am someone who is constantly at Higher Ground or Chandler Arts Center, you name it. I've been to virtually every music venue in the state. We still go see theater produced through UVM's series at the Flynn, go to the Fleming Museum, and see visual arts all over the state. So for me, it's a very important piece, but obviously for our economy, it's also very, very critical. And in the end, it helps explain why we love living here and why life's worth living, and that's the reflection it has back on the life we live. So one of the things I know about COVID-19 is that we have watched our arts organizations, and by that I mean not just organizations that might provide grants to artists, but also the facilities, whether it's Catamount Arts or the Flynn or Barry Opera House. All of these facilities are really struggling right now because they can't have performances, and this would be really a peak part of the year. So we are going to be not only working with the governor to include resources using federal funds to help replenish some of the deficit that our arts organizations are facing right now, but several of us are actively talking about developing something akin to the Works Progress Administration arts program. So back during the New Deal, many artists were actually provided with grants to go out and do commissioned theater pieces, music, murals, paintings, and so on. And we think that this is an amazing opportunity to reinvigorate that connection between communities and the arts. And so that when we get to the other side of the COVID-19 pandemic, there'll be this body of work and we'll say, wow, that was the investment that the state of Vermont decided to make. So absolutely critical and a particular passion of mine. Thanks, James. Jordan from Montpelier says, with the hit to the economy, I'm worried that people will rush to overdevelop Vermont and make it like everyone else or everywhere else. Please protect our natural lands. Yeah, it is frequently a temptation of state governments or municipal governments to say that we're going through hard times. So our response should be to try to get our way out of it by building fast or developing our way out of it. The truth is our economy is in a very, very difficult place. And the very first thing we have to do is provide support to our known, trusted, hardworking small businesses who have been here for years, supporting their communities and having the community support them. And we're not going to build our way out of this. That is not really what's wrong with the economy right now. What's wrong is we've put it in an induced coma in order to save people's lives and reduce the rate of infection. So I believe, and this reminds me a lot like in 2010, 2011, when we were coming out of the Great Recession, beginning to ease our way out of that, there were proposals to discontinue funding for land conservation in Vermont. We have an organization called the Vermont Housing Conservation Board, which both supports affordable housing and preserves working lands like agriculture and forest lands and particularly precious natural areas. And I worked with some others to make sure we did not throw away our state's proud heritage of preserving open lands. So two quick things on that note. One is this fall I finished an end-to-end north to south of the Long Trail and did it in different stretches. And it was really amazing when I got to the end and really reflected on what I had done over the course of a few years, thought about all of the pieces of land that I had just gone through, which probably 100 years ago were all being used by private owners for different purposes, largely agricultural. But people had conserved all throughout the north to south length of the Long Trail. So it was hundreds of decisions that were made by community members and property owners and local governments and state government to save these pieces of land and piece together this iconic part of what makes Vermont Vermont. And it's one of the reasons why I believe strongly that now is the time to actually invest more in conservation and not to step back, because we can't get Vermont back on its feet by turning it into something that it isn't. And I have been very proud to work with people throughout the legislature on preserving some of our most important legacy lands, whether they're down in the southern part of the state or the Stowe area or the Northeast Kingdom. A lot of that land we conserve means that we're protecting the originating source of drinking water, habitat, and so much more. So Jordan, thank you for that question. This one came in today after my speech. This was a little bit, I guess I was a little surprised and embarrassed to get this question. Liz from Winooski says, you told us a little bit about yourself. I noticed that you did not mention anything about soccer. Well, I'm not sure how much I should delve into my obsession with soccer, but it is true that one of my great outlets, I have a pretty stressful set of responsibilities managing the Senate throughout the year, and I still play as much soccer as I can. It's getting harder and harder because the college players I play against continue to be very fast, and I continue to get much slower. But it is one of the things that gives me a lot of joy. For anyone who follows me on social media, I always have tried to keep anything about what I do in Montpelier as sort of fact-based and nonpartisan as possible, because I don't think social media needs lots more flame throwing and name calling. And to the extent I throw in anything personal, it's almost always soccer. And for those of you who want to know, I'm a Barcelona fan. But don't hold that against me if you're not, and you're going to be voting in the primary. Mike from Bennington, how will your work as lieutenant governor be different depending on who wins the governor's race? A very interesting question, and in some ways, I feel very lucky. I know all three candidates. Well, there's more than three candidates for governor, but let me step back. I'll take three of the candidates, and Patrick Winburn, who's from the Bennington area, I don't know personally, so I can't really weigh in on that one. But the current governor, Phil Scott, I've known since my first day in the Vermont Senate. He actually chaired the committee I first served on, one of them, and he and I have always gotten along well. I respect him very much. He's a very honest person. We have different philosophical approaches to the role of government, its capacity to help stimulate the economy and take care of people. But that's fair. He is honest about his views. I'm honest about mine, and we've never been disagreeable in our disagreements. I think if Phil Scott is the governor, my view would be to find common ground wherever possible. And I know that there is no shortage of opportunities for us to find common ground. There are some particular areas of shared interest which are particularly have a particular potential. I see one of the questions that's coming in speaks to this a little bit, and it talks about, moving forward, what are some of the big ideas. So I'll talk about one of them in a second when I get to the question from Breck. The current Lieutenant Governor, David Zuckerman, I've known for a long time, and has been a personal friend, and served in the Senate with him for a few years before he became Lieutenant Governor. And of course, we've now been in our respective roles for 4 years. David, one of the most passionate, intelligent people in public service, and I would very much look forward to working hand in hand on a number of shared initiatives. I know that strengthening the rural economy is something he's always been passionate about, as have I. Trying to harness all of the excitement and new enthusiasm in diversified agriculture is something that I would be very eager to partner with in that regard. Also making sure that our schools have the resources they need and that they're deployed in ways that really support both the students and the teachers and staff, I think, are particularly important. We both have long viewed that we need to really come to grips with the amount of mental health and other challenges, much of which enters into the school and becomes the school's problem, not society outside the school's problem. And I don't think we've really equipped things to reflect that. And Rebecca Holcomb, I've known personally, but also in her role when she was the Secretary of Education, and is very, very bright, passionate about young children and giving them the best chance they can get. So would be particularly intrigued to work with her if she was the governor on a whole array of issues about helping give the needed support for kids who are from homes that don't have much money, which is one of the driving reasons I got into elected office in the first place. So I hope that at least partially answers it. My view is always to try to find opportunities for common ground, and I think with all three candidates I would be able to do that and hopefully be an impact player for whichever administration. This is the perils of live television. We have people knocking on the door, so you just have to bear with me for a minute. Another question, Jennifer from Newfane says, when I hear you on VPR, you often stop just short of promising support for new initiatives in the state. Why is that? Well, Jennifer, it's a keen observation, and I'll just tell you a little bit about my philosophy and what I would also take to the lieutenant governor's role. So I have always believed that government can play a helpful role and a strong role and a needed role in providing a broad foundation to support the well-being of people, to protect people, to create an environment in which businesses can compete fairly and successfully, and where people who don't have a lot of money can actually get opportunities to advance. But I also believe, in addition to that, so normally I'd be accused of being some big government person, whatever, all the name-calling stuff that happens. But I learned something when I worked for Bernie, which was his view was always that those of us who believe that government can successfully intervene and partner with the private sector and the nonprofit sector also have an obligation to prove that we are going to run things very well. And so I say those things because it really leads to two parts of my response to Jennifer's question. The first is that I sometimes worry that we have initiatives that are adopted, and we have a new program that started because it's very commendable and it's able to get through the legislature and the governor signs off. And before we get to the point where it's really doing the trick and working well, people have already moved on to the next thing. And they've already decided that their patience sort of ran out about the actual operationalizing of this other program. They want to start with the new thing. And what happens is you can quickly develop a whole list of initiatives, and you haven't really nailed any one of them because you've been so distracted creating lots of things. So sometimes I'm a little hesitant to move on to task 2 until we've got task 1 really settled. And I think that it means that I'm not out there promising things more frequently, and I'm perhaps a little more cautious sometimes, but it's because I want to make sure that the things we've already committed to doing well, that we do those well before we turn our attention to other things. Vermont state government, in its own way, people sometimes have trouble understanding its capacity to take on new challenges. There are not armies of people who sit around with notepads just, scratching their head thinking of new ideas, and it's just not like that. We have a lot of people who have specific tasks. They go out and do them every day. And the idea, though, that we have capacity to keep inventing new stuff all the time, I worry sometimes it distracts us from our primary thing. The second piece to the question, though, is that I say this with affection for so many of the people I serve with, but I have served with many legislators, some of whom, if you had 3 rooms, each one with a door to it, and behind each door, there was a group that wanted something different from the people in the other 2 rooms. I have known many elected officials, if there was just $1 extra to spend, who might go behind door 1 and tell that group they want to totally support what that group wants, and they want to give them the $1. Then they leave, shut the door, go into room 2, and they say to that group, the thing you want, I'm committing, I promise I'm going to support giving you the $1. And then on to the door 3 where the exact same thing plays out. Well, obviously you can only give out that $1 one time, not 3. And so again, I've always believed that the legislature in a small state that doesn't have tremendous sums of money, you have to be careful about promising things to different groups, because then you find yourself saying, oh, I've promised everybody, but I don't have enough to fulfill it all. And so it's one of the challenges I've always personally faced in a way, because I have kind of the heart of an activist. So I have lots of interests about things that we should be doing more of. But I've also taken on a leadership role where I have to make decisions about how we're going to deploy resources. And so sometimes that may come across as a little bit hesitant to make commitments. And I think that that's actually not an accident. It's in part a deliberate strategy of making sure that we're doing things well, and that we're not promising things we can't deliver. And so that's just who I am, the way I've operated. All right, so now I'm going to turn to a question from Breck. So let me see if I can pull this up here. And basically he's saying phase 1 was shock and awe. I'm assuming that means with the pandemic, and how to cope with all this. And Vermont has done well, deserves a lot of credit for phase 1. Now we're looking at phase 2, which is longer term recovery, and one where we have to be more strategic in addressing chronic challenges. It's time for leadership and bold decisions. My question is, what decisions might you make in the first 100 days, and what might the role of organizations like the Vermont Youth Conservation Corps play? Thank you. All right, Breck. Well, that's a particularly weighty question. And let me try to tackle that. So the first thing is, I do believe that Vermonters have come together in a really remarkable way to unite with the collective goal of reducing the number of infections and preventing as many preventable deaths as possible. There has been a lot of collective sacrifice to make that the reality, and it's not government who deserves the credit, it's everybody who deserves the credit for that. But as Breck's question points out, Phase two has not been made easier by phase one. Phase one, we basically put the economy in an induced coma in furtherance of human life, but as a result, the economy is in really difficult shape. So in terms of phase two, it's a combination of things. I think first off, I have to say that my current job, which continues until January, so I have to be running for lieutenant governor when I have the free time. In the meantime, I have to be fully dedicated to helping run the state with the governor and the speaker. We have a series of difficult financial decisions we have to make, and my goal there is to not make the kind of cuts and reductions that actually hurt people and sort of set people's lives back and set small businesses back. We want to keep making sure that we're providing the supports needed to get to the other side of this. We want to use the federal money strategically so that we're not just spending it on a one-off basis to patch a hole for a short period, but it'll pay off over time. So a few of the things, whether they're in the first 100 days or not, I'm not sure whether that timeline is quite the right framework, but I get the point. So one, in terms of organizations like the Youth Conservation Corps, I believe have an absolutely critical role in one of my key visions, which is I believe we need to go big on the idea of youth employment and youth skill development. And when I say youth, some people might say, wait a sec, 8 or 9 year olds? Like, no. I'm talking kids who are like 16 up to the age of, say, 24, largely kids who may have tremendous potential, tremendous amount of skills waiting to be tapped, but who need opportunities that their families may not be able to steer them to. Many kids in our state don't have parents who are going to connect them with internships or jobs, or who are comfortable filling out applications for student loans or grants or college, all that. So the Vermont Youth Conservation Corps, Resource, which used to be Youth Build, Vermont Works for Women, these three organizations, in my opinion, could be the central players in a robust program that offers opportunities for young people to get meaningful real world experience with a little bit of pay, where they learn how to work in a team, problem solve, get some technical skills. And the reason why I mention this now in the context of this phase two is that we know that COVID-19 and its economic damage that it's inflicted hits young people more than anyone else. The unemployment numbers for younger people is way higher than any other age group. And because of the uncertainty about the fall and who's going to be going on to campuses or whether it's all going to be remote, there are many young people who are not going to choose to go to either a 2-year or a 4-year or a certificate program in the fall, because they're going to wait and see what happens. So this is precisely a moment where we could make a substantial investment, have a small army of young people around the state all working on public-oriented projects that provide benefit, that'll be broadly enjoyed, and I think that that's absolutely critical. The other, using some of the federal funds for broadband, but not a little tiny bit, but the Senate right now, we're talking about like $100 million. And in the role of lieutenant governor, I would work to figure out how that money would get deployed and make sure that we're plugging the last gaps. The reason why it's in everyone's interest to plug those last mile gaps is because right now, if you don't have access to high-speed internet at home, it means you can't have telemedicine or telehealth, which means that you've got to do more visits to the hospital. So you're adding avoidable medical trips and medical appointments, all of which adds expense, and so that raises prices for everyone. So there's a very good cause for all of us to care that people who we've never met get high-speed internet access at their home. Same for schools. Right now, I saw a number nationally, something like 1 in 5 students they believe they're calling them like COVID dropouts. They don't have high-speed internet at home. So the moment their school shut down, that was it. There was no ongoing experience, and it just stopped. And so who knows what's happening with them? That's because in many cases, that they do not have the internet access, they don't have the technology, or their families don't know how to utilize the technology. And so that's why using broadband in a significant way statewide is really, really critical. I also think, and this is more in the first 100 days piece, that our state's economic development policies, and this is the result of governor after governor after governor, and we haven't yet had a lieutenant governor who's been out front trying to change this trajectory, but it has been in the habit of trying to chase a company here and there and hope they'll come to Vermont. It's sometimes referred to as a race to the bottom because usually you're throwing money at the company and hoping they'll come. Many of the businesses who have been lured to Vermont have been quite wonderful, and some of them pay really low pay and don't offer many benefits. So my view is that we need to orient all of the state's economic development policies around the sort of broad mission of our corporate social responsibility movement, which has largely been originated right here in Vermont. We have so many of the pioneers in the socially responsible business movement right here in Vermont. And my belief is that we should be customizing all of our state economic development programs and incentives and grants and loans so that they are funneled towards those employers who take care of their employees, take care of the planet, and of course, also make some money while they're doing it, because that's the nature of business. They need to make money. So people, planet, and profits should be the mission of our state's economic development efforts. And that's something in those 100 days I'd love to work with the small business community, the medium-sized business, and the large business community to think about how we do that cultural shift, which I think is absolutely critical. I have two more questions I'll get to before I wrap here. So one is about the release of, so this is from Kathy. It says, why can't we decarcerate more during the pandemic? And just to translate that, we have at any one time before the pandemic about 1,750 inmates in total, 1,500 of whom are in Vermont jails, and then 250 who were out of the state. I believe strongly that we need to reduce the number of people who are behind bars, because there are many who are behind bars for things that are very low risk, for recidivism, and frankly, putting someone behind bars in some instances makes them more likely to pose more of a public safety risk when they get out, versus trying to provide opportunities for community restoration and community justice, alternative forms of justice. So during the pandemic, there have been a release of a number of people, so that number is down. There's also been no uptick in crime, all of which I would say is a very positive thing. So the question really is, what can we learn something from this? The short answer is, Kathy, yes. One of my passions has been criminal justice reform. My dad was a probation officer for 43 years, and the Senate Judiciary Committee calls it the ASH challenge, because I have pushed them to come up with structural changes which preserve public safety but reduce the inmate numbers so we don't have to ship people out of state to private prisons anymore. So supporting the legislature and the governor on the mission of criminal justice reform so that we have the right people behind bars and not the wrong people is absolutely something I'm committed to. All right, I see one about the Fish and Wildlife Board, and well, I can only see much of the question. I believe the premise is that it does not include people who are not part of the hunting and trapping and fishing community, to include others who are more motivated by habitat protection, wildlife protection. And my position on that has been that I do believe there should be more diverse representation. As someone who has worked on numerous bills related to protecting animals from cruelty and neglect, on the one hand, I respect our traditional sports people, but some of what we see is just not acceptable in terms of the suffering that is endured by some animals. So I do not see why the Department of Fish and Wildlife has been so resistant to having individuals on the board who come in with a perspective, more of a conservation ethic. I think that by virtue of excluding such voices, it actually creates more of a divisiveness on these issues when there could be more of a coming together and common ground. So I do support expanding that board. And then the last question I'll take from Shannon. I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on the increased level of food insecurity we're seeing in Vermont right now. Yeah, I can tell you I've been to sort of before and after. I have seen what's called the Veggie Van Go at the Winooski Elementary and High School. I saw it before when it's a very almost celebratory atmosphere, like you're at a farmer's market and they're handing out fresh, locally grown produce to any family who comes in. They do food tastings and teach people how to prepare different vegetables, which might be not people might not be as familiar with. So that's the before time. I was there during COVID, and the line was much longer, and it was far more people from the community coming in. I was down at Gifford Medical Center at one of the distributions where the staff at Gifford were working with the Vermont Food Bank, and their line was epic. Was down near Ethan Allen Homestead in Burlington just 2 days ago and saw the line of cars on what we call the Belt Line, 127. And these are images you just can't really fathom. I mean, normally food insecurity is something that's a little out of sight and out of mind for many Vermonters, even though we know it's there. So obviously, as people's incomes have gone down, people are out of work, plus the anxiety about how long this might last, the either reduced work, the loss of work, whether the job is even going to come back. People are getting increasingly anxious and desperate and wanting to make sure that they can feed their kids. It's also worth noting, with the schools closed, while many of them have done an amazing job providing meals directly to households using the school bus routes and a whole bunch of other strategies, there are more people at home right now. So feeding at home has become more challenging. So to me, we will continue to meet the food needs, and we will do whatever it takes to make sure we're taking care of people and making sure no one who comes forward needing food gets it. We will do everything we can to make sure that we're meeting people's needs. However, what do we learn from this moving forward? I think one of the most critical elements here is that we can be democratizing the way we think about food production and food distribution. We've seen some amazing examples of restaurants stepping up and providing interesting, relatively low cost, nutritious prepared foods that people of any income level would totally love to be eating. And I think it's been an eye opener for people on both ends of both sides of the equation, those who are seeking food assistance and those who are unconventionally preparing it, and seeing that there's a lot to learn from one another. I also believe we should be using some of this federal stimulus money to increase the dollars flowing to purchase local produce. So for instance, right now our schools, we have a very significant hole in the fund that funds our schools. I would like to see the use of some of these funds to purchase substantial amounts of local produce for the upcoming school year, whatever it's going to look like. If it's in person, it'll be in the cafeterias. If it's being distributed to people's homes, it'll be in little boxes or whatever. But I think this is a moment to strengthen the relationship between buyers and producers of local food. And that will put us in good stead to be able to flexibly respond in the future. One of the concerns I have is that not all food distribution is equal. Sometimes you're getting really healthy, locally grown food. Other times you're getting boxes of, preservative-filled stuff. And I think to the extent we can support our local agricultural community while improving people's health and well-being by giving them nutritious foods, everybody wins in a whole bunch of ways. So that will be something I'm truly committed to. So with that, I think I'm going to wrap. I'll do more of these Ask Me Anythings in the coming days. But just to set some expectations, really for every 5:30 since March 13th, I have been doing a COVID-19 update. This is the first departure from that. Today, I did formally kick off my campaign for Lieutenant Governor. I had said I would not campaign during the worst part of this pandemic. Now that we're at the point where there's zero current hospitalizations with COVID-19, and we're starting to be thinking about the transition forward, and knowing that the election is just a little more than 2 months away, I had to get things going. Otherwise, it would be too late to really run any semblance of a comprehensive campaign. So using this moment to thank you for having watched my kickoff video. I hope you learn more about me and what I'm about and what I'll bring to the Lieutenant Governor's role. I'll continue to be providing the kind of updates I've been doing on an informative basis over the last couple months moving forward. But we'll also welcome your thoughts about my campaign, questions about particular issues. You'll find that I'm someone who's got a lot of curiosities and interests, and I've both professionally and in the legislature been a part of a lot of really amazing things. So happy to share those for anyone who's got curiosities. And with that, I'm going to wrap, and you'll see me back here as always at 5:30 tomorrow. And I hope you continue to stay safe.